So far in this course, we've only dealt with data structures that hold a single value. In other words, the standard variable. An integer variable holds only one number, for example, an integer a whole number, and a string, as you've seen, holds only one long sort of sequence of text. But in this video, what we're going to be talking about is a way to store multiple values of the same type. And what we're talking about is using arrays. So an array allows you to do just that. It's really a data structure that enables you to store a sequence of values that are all of the same type. So for example, you could create an array of integers, an array of characters, an array of strings, etc. This actually works for all primitive types and even objects like the string. So declaring an array initially is similar to declaring a regular variable. Let's just have a look at how to do that. So as you no doubt recall by now, you can define a regular integer variable like so. So in this case, we're defining a variable called myVariable of type int and assigning the value 50 to it. Now to go and create an array, or to define an array, just after the type, the primitive type or the object, or the class in other words, we put square brackets like that. And that actually tells the Java compiler that we're not dealing with a regular variable, we're dealing with an array. So number one, we do that. And by doing that, we've actually now invalidated this line of code because we're trying to store a regular value into an array, and that's illegal now in Java syntax. So I'm going to delete that. Now that's the standard definition. And what we can then do is we can put on the next line, if we wanted to, we can put myVariable equals new. Then we repeat the type again. So we put int. Then in square brackets, we type in the number of elements we want to assign to this array. So for example, if we wanted to add space for 10 elements, 10 individual integers in this array, we'd use the number 10 there like so. So that's actually assigned 10 elements. And of course, the other thing we can do, much like a regular variable, we can actually combine this all onto one line like so. So in this case, we defined an array called myVariable. We've told it that it's type integer, and we've assigned 10 elements to it. So to be more precise, let's put my int array. We'll call it my int array so it actually makes more sense, because that's what it actually is, an array of integers. Now this number here again is the number of elements. So that's the number of slots, or the number in this case of separate integers we want to assign to this array. So accessing those array elements, how do we access them? Well, we do something like this. We can actually, for example, to save a value, we could put something like my int value, square bracket, then a number, say 5, equals 50. So that's actually saving the value 50 into element. Now you'd look at that and you think, maybe, well, that's obviously saving that into element 5, but it's actually saving it into element 6. And the reason for that is with all arrays in Java, they always start the count at position 0, at number 0. So in other words, if you want to access the very first element of an array, you start from position 0. So in this case, new int 10. So the first element, you'd use number 0, and right up until the last element, you'd actually use number 9 to allocate that. So in other words, instead of starting from 1 and finishing on 10, you start from 0 and finish on 9. It sounds confusing, but you'll soon get used to that. If you just remember that you always start counting from 0 in Java with arrays, it will make a lot of sense. So in this case, what we've done, looking at this code line, my int array, the number 5 in square brackets, and it's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's actually element 6 equals 50. So that's how we're actually assigning that value. In terms of arrays, again, it's very similar. Syntax for other data types. We could change this to a double, for example, if we wanted to. And come back here and change this also to a double. And change the variable name. And that would actually assign an array called my double array with 10 elements, and each of those elements could be stored, could have stored in them a double. So that's how we go about defining the array, and how we go about defining or storing a value in the array elements. The other thing you might want to do is actually retrieve a value from a particular element, and to do that, we can actually do something very similar. We can just put, and I'll just output this just to show you, my int array, and we'll put 5 there, and that's going to now dump out or print to the screen element 6. If we run that, and we're starting the count from 0 in case you're wondering why that's 6. We're getting the value 50, which we actually stored in this line here. So that's how we go about actually retrieving the values as well. So just remember, if you define, whatever you define the variable to be, that's the type of data that will fit in that array. So you can't, for example, put a double into an integer array in much the same way you can't assign a double value, a variable, into an integer variable. It won't work either. So that was one way to initialize. You could go through, if you wanted to, in this case, if we wanted to initialize every value in the array, we could go right through and we could sort of start from, my int array 0, equals 45. My int array 1 equals 476, etc. That could become quite tedious. So there isn't actually another shortcut that Java gives us. If we know ahead of time the values we want to actually save in an array, we can do something like this. I can put my int array equals, we can put 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. But the reason we're getting an error there is we need to actually copy this into this at this place here, because this is only applicable the first time we define the variable. So if I do something like that and then delete this out. So what we've actually done here is we've actually told Java, these are the numbers we want you to assign into the array, but we've also indirectly told Java how many elements are in that array by the actual number of values that are in this curly brace initializer block here, separated by commas. So the fact is there's actually 10 elements in there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Java looks at that and automatically assigns 10 elements to this integer array. And then it also goes through and actually adds the values for each of those into each array element. And just to confirm that, we could actually print a couple of these out. Get rid of this double now because we're not using that. And we'll just do a couple, say position 6 and position 8. If we run that. And you can see we've got position element 0 is the value number 1. Position 6 or element 6 is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, as you can see there, starting from 0. So it's actually element 0. So that's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's why we've got 7. And again, the element 8 is actually the 9th element, which would be this one here, which is the number 9. And that's why the numbers 1, 7, and 9 match up like you can see there on the screen. And finally, there's also a third way to initialize. So if we go back now and actually just comment that out for now. I'm just going to set that up and comment that out like so. So what I'll do is I'll just create a new integer array. So what equals new int 10 again. So back to our 10 elements. So at the moment they haven't got any values, and I'll delete these output lines now because they're no longer appropriate. We can actually use a for loop to initialize them. So we can put something like this. We can put for int I equals 0, I less than 10, I plus plus. Then we can actually put my int value I equals, and let's just say the form is going to be I times 10. So what we're doing there is we're actually going through each element of the array, starting from element 0 with our for loop. And you can see my int array I in brackets means access element, in this case 0 will be the first time it's called through in the loop. We're assigning I times 10 to it. We're going right through to the entire, or for the entire array, and going through saving the values. And just to confirm that, we could do a second loop for int I equals 0, I less than 10, I plus plus. We can do some output. We'll put element 0, or element plus I should say, plus value is my int value, and my int array I should say I. So we run that now, we should actually get some output. Element 0, and you can see the first time we went through the value is 0, 10, 20, 30, 40, and so on. And again, the calculation for that is it's whatever the index entry for the for loop that we're going through, multiplying that by 10. So the first time we go through this, we're accessing element 0 because I is 0. 0 times 10, of course, is going to be 0, and I is set to 0, so that's our element 0. Next time we go through, I is going to be set to 1, so we're updating element 1 in our array. So in other words, my int array 1 equals 1 times 10, which is 10, and so on, as you can see, right through up until 9 when the value is 90. So that's a great way to initialize it if you've got some sort of formula that you know ahead of time that you can actually use to assign to the particular element in the array. One of the other good things I recommend you do though is rather than hard coding numbers here, it can be a good idea to use a method that actually is given to you automatically with arrays, and it's called the length. So we do the array name, my int value dot length. I think I said it was a method, but it's actually a property. So it's actually a field that's stored that comes as part and parcel of the array. And length gives us the length automatically. So Java will actually look into the array and decide or tell you what the length of that is. So the good thing about that is if we change that there, and we also go back in here, and we put my int dot length as well, and we run that, we should get exactly the same result. As you can see, exactly the same as it was before. But the good thing also is we can change this. So we can make this, say, 25 and run it. And you can see we've now got the values cycled through from 0 to 24. And that's because we've used the lengths field, the value that comes back from the array automatically from Java, Java has determined, okay, you've changed the length to 25 elements, and it's automatically set it up so we didn't need to change the code for that to work. So it's a good idea to use .length with arrays whenever you want to actually cycle through or figure out what the length is, rather than hard coding a value, because you can see there in this example, it makes your code, I would argue that it's easy to read, but certainly also there's less work for you to maintain, because literally if otherwise you'd actually have to change 25. In this case, when we changed from 10 to 25 elements, we would have had to change that code as well, which doesn't seem much now, but as you start producing more and more Java code, you'd find that you'd be needing to make these changes in a lot more places, and you'll just be opening yourself up to causing errors. Because one of the things you will actually get, you'll actually get a problem if you try and access an element that's not there. So if we change this and we put 30, we'll actually get an error. So if we run this, so you can see what's happened is we've actually got an exception, and the exception is array index out of bounds. And the reason that it's out of bounds is we've actually used a number that's actually too high. So we've only got 25 elements, and we've tried to access an element greater than 25. You'll get an error if you do that. You can only access as many elements as you've created. So if we just undo that change and go back to here and do it, you'll probably see it a little bit better, because it should actually still output the first 25 elements before it crashes in this case. So again, the problem here is the number of elements that we're actually defining is invalid. So we're going to go back and change that. So it's just easier, as you can see, to make sure that obviously we actually use the right number, but we want to actually assign the actual number in as few places as possible, because that then prevents any weird errors coming up, as you can see came up before when we started trying to override what we knew were the correct values. So that's how to go about, in this case, printing out the number. Now the other thing you can use, of course, is with any value, with any variable in Java, including arrays, is we can pass those to methods. So what we can do is we're going to take this bit of code here, we're going to create a method from it, and then we're going to call that method. So we're going to create a new one called public static void print array. We're actually going to send it our array, and to define that as a parameter, as an argument, we put int, same definition before the square brackets, and we'll call it array. So, and then if we paste in our code, then what we need to do is we need to just change the definition to match the parameter, like so. And then now we should just be able to call our method print array and pass our array that we've defined called myPrintArray. So it's doing a very similar thing, but we're just passing the array. Notice on the definition that is actually the code that's calling the method, we don't put square brackets in there. If we do that, we'll get weird things happening. We'll get an error. We only define the type in the parameter, as you can see there. So if we run that, we should get identical results printing out, as you can see we're getting. So that's how to go about actually showing it or printing it out and passing an array as a method. Okay, so what I'm going to do is delete this on the screen now. I'm going to show you another use. So what we're going to do is just delete all that out. I'm going to actually show you a real life use of using an array where it would become valuable. And what we're going to do is we're going to accept some input from the console. So in other words, allow the user of the program to type in some numbers. We're going to sum up those total numbers and then figure out what the average is of those numbers that were actually typed in. So this could be a good use of an array. This again, we're dealing with multiple numbers, and that's where arrays are really great. So firstly, let's define something called a scanner, and we'll talk about that shortly what it is, but private static scanner. Case is important here. You can see java.util is coming up automatically. Anytime you see something that starts with java dot, in this case .util, that's something that comes with Java. And we're going to call that scan, and let's call it scanner. You can see it's asking to accept the import, so I'm going to do that. And we'll call it scanner, and it equals new scanner. And we pass a parameter called system.in. Now you've seen system.out before when we've actually dumped code. We do that all the time. You can actually see that to the right of the screen now. We use system out for that. System.in is the opposite in that it allows you to type input into the console that gets returned back to the program. So that's what we're doing there, is we're defining this static variable, or field I should say, called scanner, and we're going to be using that in the code to actually retrieve that. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off, we're going to put int, an array int, we're going to call it myIntegers equals getIntegers 5. So what that means is we're going to actually create a method, and that method is going to automatically allow us to type in 5 numbers and to then return those 5 numbers in the form of an array. And that those contents will be stored in our myIntegers array. So to do that, public static int as an array. Int, 2 square brackets means we're returning an array. Get integers, and int will be numbers, or number I should say, and the number in this case is the number of array elements that we want to define for our array. So we're going to print out a message first, and the message is going to just put enter plus number integer values. We're going to put a \r there so it goes to the next line, and you'll see why shortly when we're running it. Next we need to define our array. I'm going to call it values equals new int number. So we're passing, or we're actually using the number that was passed to us, in this case number, and that's how many elements we're assigning to this array. By doing it this way, we've got some flexibility in that this will be able to accept any number. We can chop and change that as needed. Then we just need to create a for loop for int I equals 0, I less than values.length, I plus plus. Then we assign the value now. We put values, as you've seen before, values I. So starting on position element 0, we're going to go through the entire array, equals, and it's going to be scanner dot next int. Now the scanner.next int automatically accepts an integer from the console, and that then returns an integer, and that's going to be stored in our array. And finally, we're just going to return the array back to the calling process. So in this case, what we're doing is we're defining an array called myIntegers, and the actual value of the array is being passed back from this method to automatically, and it's going to be assigned to myIntegers. So at the end of this, after it's made this call, not only have we defined the length of the array, but we've also got the contents of it as well. So just to confirm that, then we're going to put a for loop there for int I equals 0, I less than myIntegers.length, I plus plus. And we're just going to print that message out to see what the typed value was. Let's just run this and see that it works. First, it's asking us to enter 5 values. You notice when I click my mouse in there, it automatically went to the next line. If I didn't put the /r here, it would be actually asking for input as the first one there, which we didn't want. We actually wanted it on this line. That's the reason I put that /r there. So let's enter 5 values. So 10, 26, 52, 66, and the last one, 23. You can see element 0, type value was 10, 26, 52, 66, 23. So you can see that this has returned that array, and we've got the correct values in there. So we're nearly done. So we've actually got the values. Next thing we need to do is actually create another method. In this method, we're going to pass the array again, and we're going to get it to return what the actual average of the numbers are. So again, the average is calculated by determining the sum of all the values in the array and dividing that by the actual length. So let's do that. We're going to do public static double. We'll call this one get average, and then we need to pass our array. That's going to be we'll call this one array, and we're returning a double because with an average we may actually get a number that's not a whole number as the result. So we want to make sure that the number that we return can cope with whole numbers, or in the case of an average being not a whole number, show that correct value as well. And we'll see that in operation shortly. So we need to define a local variable that is the sum total. I'm going to call that sum and set that to 0. I'm going to create a for loop again for int I equals 0, I less than array.length, I plus plus. We're going to go through the entire array. Then we need to assign whatever the current value is of the current array element as we cycle through using the for loop. We need to add that to sum. So we're going to put plus equals array and the I element. The plus equals, if we didn't put a plus equals, of course we wouldn't be recording the other values. It'd be overriding it each time. Plus equals means that we're actually adding to it. So that's good. So we've now got the total sum is now stored in the variable called sum. So now to figure out to return the average is simply dividing sum by the length. But then we want to convert the result to a double. So we're going to put return double sum divided by double array dot length. Again, using doubles to make sure that we're actually returning a double, and it's just dividing the total sum of all the values in the array by the actual length. So the last thing we should need to do is actually just update our main method and print out a message. So we can put something like the average is get average and pass our array. So if we run that, and we'll store our three values, we'll put something like 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and put the average is, we should have put a space there. Let's run that again. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The average is 5.0. So 7 plus 6 is 13, plus 5 is 18, plus 4 is 22, plus 3 is 25. So that's 25 is our sum there. And 5 elements, 25 divided by 5 is 5. And notice also that IntelliJ is showing you these numbers in green, which is its way of saying that these numbers were actually typed in from the console, which is pretty handy. So that's our function, getAverage, which actually returns an average of the total number of elements. And just one last example, just to show the definition of why we needed a double. So we enter one more number. Let's just use a number that we know is not going to evenly divide. So we'll say 100 plus 50, 15, so 5 and a 2. And that would give us 34.4 because that's 150, 165, 172. 172 divided by 5 is 34.4. So that's why we needed to use the double there. So this video has gone way longer than I had hoped it would go for. So I hope you got a lot out of that. In the next video, what we're going to do is we'll do our challenge for arrays, and we'll talk about that and see you in the next video.